and welcome to the third lecture by Dr. Walter Vogels, whom you already know from last night and this morning, and therefore I will, without more ado, invite Walter to carry on enlightening us on the interpreting the scriptures today. And this afternoon, the text is the judge. At last, we may have some authority here to find ground.
So you have noticed that there are at least two approaches to a text. Last night we spoke about what happens to text if we look at the text asking ourselves what was the intention of the writer. This morning we spoke about a way of looking at text from saying, after all, it is the reader who gives meaning to the text, so what happens when that is accepted as a principle. And you have noticed that that can lead to rather contradictory and conflicting interpretations. By the way, I did not mention that this morning, but did you notice that, for instance, that conflict between what I have called the religious reading and the Marxist reading of that text, you remember? That both of those writers based themselves upon the fact that it is the Yahwist who wrote it. But if you remember what I said last night, if the Yahwist does not exist, or if the Yahwist did not write at the time of Solomon, then of course the two interpretations collapse. If the Yahwist was writing at the time of the exile, of course he cannot write in support or against the monarchy, because the monarchy was dead for a while. And so you see that reading, I hope you don't lose courage and you don't say, I'm never going to read the Bible again, because we never know what the Bible says. So this afternoon we will give you the answer. So we are going to look at what happens now if we favor not the writer and if we don't favor the reader, but if we now look at the text, and I have chosen as the title, the text is the judge. And you will notice during this afternoon what I mean by that. So I will proceed again in the same way. I will first explain to you the presuppositions and the theory. Then I will apply it upon the text, always the same text of Paradise. And then I will come to the conclusion. And at the end of the lecture, I will come to a global conclusion of the three lectures that I have given. So, what we have been saying until now, in a certain sense, applies to the spoken word and to the written word. In the spoken word, you have the speaker and you have the listener. In the written word, you have the writer and the reader. And because there are similarities between the two, between the written and the oral word, do you see that people sometimes did not notice enough that there is also an important difference? In the oral communication, you have only two actors. You have the speaker and the listener. In the written communication, there is a third actor. It's not only the writer and the reader, but there is also the text. I'm going to reflect a little bit on the oral communication and then show you the difference with the written communication. In the oral communication, the two actors, speaker and listener, are in each other's presence. So consequently, there is a lot that goes on besides simply the talking. When you are teaching, when you are speaking, you see at the faces of people that they are sleeping. So you know that your teaching does not come across. Or you see that people seem to agree or disagree. Do you see that a lot goes on in the oral communication? And I would like you, I have listed here a certain number of reactions that happen between speaker and listener, because the listener at a certain moment can become speaker too, can ask questions. And, I'm going to give you a few of them, and perhaps you can make a longer list of them, but at least a few may illustrate what's happening in oral communication. The listener may react to what is said by, listen to this here. You said so and so. And the speaker may reply, no, I did not. I said so and so. Ever had that experience? Or it may happen also, you said so and so. And the reply may be, oh, did I? That is not what I meant. What I meant to say was so and so. Or another reaction, you said so and so. And the reply may be, oh yes, I did not have that in mind when I spoke. But of course, what I said could mean that. Or the following reaction, you said so and so. And the reply, well, not exactly. You see, when I use such and such a word, it has such and such associations for me. So the statement has a lot more overtones than you suggest. And we can continue. I have a few more, but I think you have enough. So do you see that in oral communication, all kinds of things happen. Questions can be asked. People can react. And at least we realize that what the speaker intends to say is not necessarily what the listener understands. I don't know, I suppose a few of you must be teachers, and I don't know if you agree with me, that by experience you know that what you said is not always understood in the same way. And there is something else that as a teacher I have difficulties with. I like to teach. I love it. But I like students to be there. And for instance, it's much more difficult if you have to teach for distant learning, to sit in front of a microphone and they make a tape of you. And I noticed that they have been taping that. But did you see that if anyone is going to listen ever to those tapes, that this is going totally different from the exchange that we had here together? So, if we have now oral communication, do you see that something is going to be different also when you speak about, on the phone for instance? When you speak on the phone, that's not the same communication as if the person is present. Okay, now you easily realize that when it comes to the written word, that there is that tremendous difference that the writer and the reader are not present to each other. The writer finished the book, and in that text there are a lot of gaps of which we spoke this morning, and that text now is given in the hands of the reader. And like I noticed that the listener does not always understand what I'm saying, so I know that the reader is not always going to read what I intended to say. Now, on the other hand, I have to accept that as a writer. I have to accept that my text can be understood in different ways. And that's the risk of writing. There is a person who precisely works with an approach to text like I'm going to explain this afternoon. And that person made once an analysis of a text of a writer who still was living. Okay? He made the analysis and he went to see the writer and he said, that's what your text says. And the writer says, you are right. Exactly, that's what that text says. Even if I had never been thinking of that. And as a writer, then I have to accept it. That's what my text says. And by the way, if you read things that you wrote 20 years ago, I would like even to stress this by something else, by an example which is rather clear, I think, that there are cases where to read according to the intention of the writer, or what the writer had in mind, what a historical person had in mind, would lead to unfaithfulness to the text. Understand that? I read the text now, and I would read the text according to what the historical writer had in mind. That reading would become unfaithfulness to the text. And I would like to illustrate that with a very clear example, I think, I hope. If you go to Washington, there is the monument to commemorate President Jefferson, very close to the White House and the Capitol. And in that monument there are all kinds of texts, and perhaps some of you have seen those texts. And on one of those texts is this: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And you know that Jefferson had slaves. All men are created equal. So what Jefferson had in mind when he wrote that text, or when he spoke that text, he had in mind that the American colonies in their fight had as many rights as the British in their fight of independence. But what people at that time did not realize, that people of all races and all colors had the same rights. And I could add to that, that if really I would read the text as Jefferson had it in mind, I think, would mean that all the adult white males are equal. Now, if you love animals, and you would say, Jefferson speaks about the equal rights between humans and animals, do you see that perhaps I would have to say that's not exactly what that text says? Do you start seeing things? Do you start noticing that a text, once the text is written, is a reality in itself? The text becomes a reality in itself, and it is that text which will be, in the last instance, the judge of our readings. That text is going to say, and if the text could speak, could you imagine if the text could speak? If the text could speak, I think especially the Bible would say how many times we have abused the Bible. So the text will say, and the text will guide us to say, those meanings, of the variety of meanings that each one of us can give to a text, because we are all different and because we all change over the years, that text is going to say at a certain moment that reading is acceptable and that one is unacceptable. You cannot accept. That's not in my text. So what we are going to reflect upon is no longer the world in front of behind the text, the world of the writer. We are not going to reflect upon the world in front of the text, the world of the reader, but we are going to concentrate upon what? Upon the world of the text itself. The text is a world on its own, of its own. The text is a network of relations and of structures, beautifully held together, which gives that text a unity. And consequently, you will see that this afternoon we are going to take the text, and I'm going to use a technical word, I will explain it, in a synchronic approach. Synchronic means the text in its final form. The text in its final form. And when we speak about the Bible, we say we take the text in its canonical form. Author-centered analysis approaches look at the text diachronically, which means they look at the text and they see all type of irregularities in the text. You remember that? That people say, how can it be that in that text they are clothed and they are naked and they are again clothed? He is in the garden and they put him again in the garden. You remember those things? So they look at the text diachronically. They say the text had an evolution, a history, growth in the text. And often with the implication that what was original, that was at the beginning, is the real pure thing. All the additions, of course, they came to spoil the text. Maybe, but I have a feeling that new readings enrich the text, give new meanings and grow to the text. Now, if text can be read by people who don't even know the writer, who belong to total different cultures, belong and live in total different periods in time, there must be something in text which makes those texts understandable in the text itself. As you remember, we don't even know who the writer is. We know that the writer is totally different from us, and still, I think that we can read. How is that possible? Because in a text there are relations, and there are three types of relations. Three types of relations. There is, first of all, what is called the intratextual relations. In other words, relations in the text itself. Intratextual relations. Which means that words in a text relate to each other. That sentences relate to other sentences in the text, or the whole play that goes on in the text itself. Intratextual relations. Secondly, a text has relations with other texts, which is called the intertextual relations. Do you remember what Bruggeman did? When Bruggeman was reading that text here, he was hearing at the same time the text of David. Intertextual relations, connections. And of course they help us to understand texts. It is because we have read other texts that we can read other texts or new texts. And finally, there are what is called the extra-textual relations. The reader will understand the text because there is a world outside of the text that corresponds to that. When I read in a text table, I understand the word table because I know what the table is in the real world. So there are intratextual relations, there are intertextual and extra-textual relations. Now, I will concentrate this afternoon upon the intratextual relations. In other words, the play that goes on in the text itself. What goes on, what are those? And the principle is that each text respects a grammar. Each text respects a grammar. And I'm sorry that perhaps this afternoon I'm going to be a little bit more technical, and that's why I hope that that blackboard is going to be helpful, at least for the people who are here, not for the people who may listen to the tape there. Huh? So those people who look at text, at the play that goes on in text, they start from the principle that if text can be read, that means that there is something in those texts that makes it possible to read. And they start from what we know from sentences, from a phrase. And I'm going to start from that and from there move into what stories are, what texts are. I'm going to write a simple sentence. Johnny loves Betty. There is a first level there in that text, in that sentence, what we call the surface. Do you see that at the surface, and I selected on purpose Johnny loves Betty. Do you see that Johnny, Betty, there is type of a play that goes on? So that's what we say that at the surface, what you hear, what you can see. Okay, I don't speak about that. Now, the next step that we do when we have a sentence is something that I don't see there. I don't see that, what I'm going to say next. But something that we call the syntax of that sentence. What do we mean by the syntax of that sentence? Of course, you all know that. The syntax of that sentence says what? That Johnny is the subject, that loves is the verb, and that Betty is the object. Okay? May I just ask you to reflect on what we just said here? Do you see that any child is going to apply that rule? And if the child does not do that, if the child says, Coke loves me or likes me, the mother or the father is going to say, no. You have to say, I like Coke. But the mother or the father is not going to say, because the subject of the sentence is this and this. No. Do you see that gradually it comes something that's part of us to apply that rule? It's only when we went to school that we started learning, understanding what we have been doing since we were young. And even after we have studied that, when we speak, do you see that we are not going to ask ourselves now, wait a minute now, I'm going to formulate my next sentence, wait a minute. What is going to be the subject of that sentence? Do you see that this has become something which is so spontaneous in us that it is deep in us that we don't even think about it anymore, okay? And I would add something more. Once you know now the syntax of that sentence, do you see that you can now analyze all sentences? Because with that principle now I can analyze, we eat potatoes. So I have a key for all sentences. And something more I would like to add. I have a key which does not apply only to the English language, but applies to my language too. And applies to French, and applies to German, and applies to Italian, and applies to all languages in the world. We have touched now, what did we touch? We touched a universal human principle, which makes communication possible. Which makes it possible that people of different cultures can communicate, that text can be translated. We have now touched a universal principle. And I have now at least something that I know of that sentence already. Do you see that if a person says now, the text says that Betty loves Johnny, I have to say, I'm sorry, that's not what that sentence says. And if you say, yes, but if Johnny loves Betty so much, Betty certainly must love Johnny too, I say, I'm sorry, that's an hypothesis. You cannot conclude that from your text. Do you start seeing a little bit how the text is going, in the final analysis, become a judge of our readings? But I suppose that after I have said that Johnny loves Betty, if I have said that Johnny is the subject, the verb, and the object, perhaps we want to know a few more things, eh? I don't know if you want to know a few more things, but I would like to know a few more things. What would I like to know? Who is Johnny? And what does it mean when Johnny loves Betty? And who is Betty? Because, of course, that sentence can become totally different if Betty is the wife of Johnny, or if Betty is the dog, or if Betty is the neighbor, or, okay? The sentence would become very different, even if it is still subject, verb, and object. And this is what we call the semantics. Or the themes, or the thematic value, whatever. Starting from that principle, that in a sentence you have like 3 levels, the surface, the syntax, and then the content, the meaning, semantics. People have said the same thing must happen in a text, in a larger literary unit. There is also the surface. And that text we can speak about the surface structures. I'm not speaking now about the sentence. I'm speaking about a larger literary unit, like, for instance, the story that we are going to speak about this afternoon again. So on a story, you have the surface structures. Those of you who are familiar with biblical studies, you have those studies that make A, B, C, C, B, A, that type of thing. For those of you who are familiar with it, that's what we call the surface structures. But then you have what corresponds to the syntax at the level of the sentence. We speak about narrative structures. Narrative structures, and I hope you understand the word. A text is a narration. A text tells something. And thirdly, what corresponds to the content, to the meaning, to the semantics, is what is called the discursive structures. The discursive structures. What do we mean by that? A text is a discourse. A text communicates something. And that's why this is called the discursive structures. Now, the comparison with the sentence, and that's why I started from the sentence, things that you know, has indicated that those rules that we have discovered for the sentence are universal human rules, not only for one culture, but transcend cultures and historical differences. Those rules, those structures that we are going to explain to you, are also structures that transcend particular cultures. Those are structures that you find in all stories. You may say, but if that's the case, what's the, what is the excitement of reading? Oh, very much so. To know those rules makes reading possible. You knew those rules, but you never were conscious of it. Now this afternoon you are going to become conscious of things that you have been doing since you were... it can be compared a little bit with football game or tennis or whatever. How is it possible that a team that comes from Cameroon can play football or soccer against a team from Italy? Why is that possible? Because they respect the rules. But at the same time, do you see that there is not one single game that's exactly the same as the other one? So in any football game or any soccer game, the game is possible because they respect structures, rules, but at the same time there is a spontaneity of each game. And this is the same thing with writers. Writers can only write, and readers can only read, because they have common structures. They are the players of the game. They apply the same rules. If they don't apply the same rules, they cannot communicate. They apply the same rules, but at the same time there is a spontaneity, the freedom of each writer. So I'm going to say now a few words about the narrative structures there. Okay? The narrative structures. I hope that you will forgive me that I cannot explain that in half an hour, something which is rather complex, but I hope that I can give you at least a few hints or what we mean by a text-centered analysis. And of course you can read in specialized books much more details. I will give you roughly a few principles, and then I will apply some of those basic principles upon the text that you see at least how it works. For the narrative structures. In a text, you can have only two things that can be said about a person. Only two things. A person is or a person does. That's all. All the rest, it can always be reduced to the person does something or the person is. And consequently, to have a text, what is a text? A text is something very simple. Very simple. A person is something, and through the action, the person becomes something else. That's what the text is. The person was not married, and at the end the person is married. Okay? I was in Ottawa yesterday, now I'm in Halifax. Okay? And so, a text is very simple. A text starts with what they call a begin state. And if the action works, succeeds, the begin state will be transformed in an end state. So I hope that you see what I'm doing. I'm giving you the rules like you have learned years ago for the syntax of a sentence. Like there is a subject, a verb, and an object. In all stories, what do you have? In all stories, you have a begin state. You have something that makes that change into the end state. Okay? The begin state is always something that's not there yet. So we call that a negative. And when I say negative, it does not mean that it is bad, that it is morally evil. What I mean by negative is the thing is not there yet. Because if the thing is there, there is no action. If I am already in Halifax, I cannot come to Halifax. Simple. So the begin state is negative. In other words, the thing is not there yet. And if the transformation works, if I don't have an accident with the plane, I will arrive in Halifax at the end here, okay? Now, how does a person act? How does a person act? In other words, let us reflect a little bit on the transformation, because this is the being and that's the action, the doing. How do you act? Do you see that you never act? There is always something that pushes you to do something. Would you agree on that? You want to do that, or you are forced to do that, or you are invited to do that, or you are manipulated to do that, or you are tempted to do that. Do you see? There is always something that motivates you. Otherwise, there is no action. Something or someone is going to motivate you to do something. Now, the people who work with those things, they have given one term to express that. And the term is really badly chosen because the word in normal English has a very negative connotation. They call that the manipulation. So forget that the manipulation has nothing to do with manipulate a person. This is simply to to speak about all possible ways that a person is going to act. Okay? How did I come here? You know, I said that I was in Ottawa yesterday and that I am in Halifax now. Why am I here? Do you see that I am here because I was invited? So someone manipulated me. Huh? Do you start seeing what? Huh? Okay. Now, do you see that when you are invited or when you are obliged to do something, before you can act, something precedes that? If they would have invited me here to come and talk about mathematics, I would have said, I'm really sorry, thank you very much. But they asked me to speak about the Bible, and you have to judge yourself. Huh? I thought that I could say a few things about that book. So, do you see that before you can act, you need the competence? You need the competence. So no person is ever going to be capable of acting if the person has not the competence to do that. If you have the competence, okay, you can move to the performance. To the performance. And after the performance, you have what we can call the sanction. The sanction, the evaluation, the verification. And I suppose that you all understand what I'm saying here. Huh? Do you see, and you, all of you who are teachers, you know that this is true. Do you see that you all are evaluating me? Right? And the person who invited me, certainly. Obviously. So, was that understood a little bit? Huh? So that to have a story, to have any text, what are the elements? A text is a transformation from one state into another state, and that transformation follows certain rules. Nobody acts unless you are motivated to do so. You never can act unless you have the competence to do that. And by the way, do you read now some of the text of the gospel? Jesus could not do there any miracles because of the lack of faith of the people. And do you see that at a certain moment when Jesus dies on the cross and the Roman soldiers said, this man was really the Son of God? You start seeing a little bit, you know, of course I know that it is impossible in a few minutes to explain that, but believe me, this is the structure of all texts. Okay, all texts work with those elements. Thirdly, after the surface structures and the narrative structures, what I just explained, you remember there are the discursive structures, eh? Okay. I am the time goes on, so I have no time, but basically the discursive structure is that you look in the text and you try to figure out the different themes of the text. Okay, the different themes of the text. And in the themes you see oppositions. Now, I know that this is too brief, but I would like now to apply some of those principles upon the narrative of the text that we have been speaking about now yesterday and this morning. So please let us look at the text now. At the time when Yahweh God made earth and heaven, there was as yet no wild bush on the earth, nor had any wild plant yet sprung up. Do you start seeing something? How does the text start? With a negative. Something is missing, okay? Something is not there, so an action can start. Eh? At the time when Yahweh God made earth and heaven, there was as yet no wild bush on the earth. nor hath any wild plant yet sprung up. And the text moves on and explains why. For Yahweh God hath not sent rain on the earth, nor was there any Adam to till the soil. So the text says, the text starts with a negative. There was nothing there. Why not? Do you see there are two reasons given? There was no rain, and there was no Adam. And here now, do you see that the text raises a problem? Because the word Adam, as I have said this morning, means so the word Adam means humanity, means a human person, and sometimes it is referring to the man, to the male. Okay? So, how am I going to translate that now? Am I going to say there was no human person, there was nobody, in other words? Or am I going to translate there was no male? Okay? How are we going to solve that gap of the story? You remember this morning the gaps in the stories? How are we going to solve that? Do you see that most of the time people are inclined to solve that by being a little bit too curious, and they read the end of the story. And what do we find at the end of the story? That the woman is created. And so from there people say, so if the woman appears on the end, that means that the man there must be a male. Okay? And I say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Because now you are reading the story backwards. I don't know that yet, what is going to be said in verse 21. You follow my reading? I'm only in verse 6. And so I have to solve that question that I have as a reader here. I cannot wait until verse 21 to solve it. I have to solve it here. And so how do we find now the meaning of that word? What are the sound principles of reading is the context, or the sentence in which it is used. Okay? Now, if you look at a sentence, why is the earth still a desert? Because there was no rain and there was no what? Do you see that the sentence does not give me the key? On the contrary, I know that in many cultures, women cultivate perhaps more than male, or in other as much as males, or in other. So it is not because there is not a male that there is no agriculture, but it is because there is no human person. And this now, that interpretation that I find in the sentence itself is confirmed by if you read the preceding chapter. So a reader who has read the text synchronically, you understand what I said here? You follow the text and not, okay? If you have read chapter 1 of Genesis, chapter 1 verse 26 and 27, the text says, let us make Adam in our image and likeness. God created Adam, male and female, he created them. So there certainly the word Adam means what? Humanity, or a human person. So do you see that I as a reader now here have to conclude that for the time being I have to translate it by what? There was nobody. There was no human person. Okay? So let us move on. And that's what I as a reader have to conclude. If later on I discover that I was wrong, I can correct it later. But for the time being, that's all that I can conclude. So, Yahweh God fashioned a human person from the dust of the soil Then he breathed into his nostrils a breath of life, and thus that human person became a living being. Now you, as a reader, what would you now expect that the text is going to say? If you really have followed the story said there was nothing. Why not? Because there was no rain and there was nobody. Okay? However, says the text, there was a flood, so there is water, and now there is a human being. So do you see that normally as a reader you would expect now what? That human person who has been created starts cultivating. Isn't that what you would expect as a reader? But like I said this morning, you never know what the text is going to do. And now look at the surprise of the story. Because now look what the text says. Yahweh God planted a garden in Eden. So instead that the human person starts to become the farmer, it is God who becomes the farmer. You know, I have no time to go through the whole text, but do you see how I work with the text? I respect the text as much as we can. I jump to verse 16. Verse 16 of that story. Then Yahweh God made the human person this admonition. You may eat indeed of all the trees in the garden. Nevertheless of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you are not to eat, for on the day you eat of it you shall most surely die. Do you understand the principle? It's not good for that applies to the human person. Otherwise, if it is only for the male, do you see that the female could have eaten of that apple? And exegetes had a long problem with that. And they said, yes, probably the man must have said it to his wife. But if I would have been the wife, I would have said, that's your business. You know, God told it to you. No, but let's be honest. What we read now applies to a human person. And so the text goes on. Text goes on. And instead that the human person now, again, as a reader, I would expect now that we read that the human person is going to eat or not to eat. Now, the text says, again, a surprise of the text. Yahweh God said, it is not good. Aha, it is not good. What does that? Where are we on the structure? A sanction. He said, hey, what I just made is not good. He had created a human person, right? And now God said it is not good. So after he has created, he says, what I did is not good. It's not good that a human person should be alone. I will make him or her a helpmate. And by the way, do you start seeing a little bit the difference of interpretation of that story, what that text is saying? It's not good for a human person to be alone. It's not for a male, it's for a human person to be alone. You need the helpmate, you need the other one. And the male need that and the female need that. As a human person, you need the opposite. And do you see that we are back into what? To a negative, something is missing. So the story now, when you have seen the story this morning, God starts creating the animals. And when the human person sees those animals arrive, you know what the human person said? It's nice, but that's not what I was looking for. Okay? And then God says, if it is like that, in other words. He said, let's start all over again, and then he creates, you know, the story of the rib, etc. And then for the first time, and now very interesting, for the first time we see in the story appearing Ish and Isha, which means what? Man and woman. Until now we speak about a human person, and now appears Ish and Isha, man and woman. You know, I know that I went too fast through all that. You can read, if you are interested, things that I have published. And as I said, I hope to publish the lectures that I have given you here with much more details. But I hope that you start seeing a little bit what we did this afternoon, how it works. You apply the grammar. You apply the grammar. By the way, I hope that you have seen now that the whole fight that we had this morning about who is superior in the equality, do you see how it is gone? The text does not speak about that. The text speaks about our need as human beings for the other. And do you see that, and now I apply another principle of a discursive analysis, do you see that as a human person, you only can identify yourself as male when? When there is a female. And the female can only identify herself as female when there is a male. So, of course, the text could only speak about the human person in the beginning and can only speak. When they are with the animals, do you see that in front of an animal you identify yourself as human? But it is only when you have the other that you say, hey, I'm different, I'm male. Did you follow a little bit what we did here? Okay. I would like simply to show you a few more things. In verse 24 of chapter 2, this is why a man leaves his father and mother and joins himself to his wife, and they become one body. So do you see that in the beginning of the text says it is not good to be alone, and now they are two. Okay? So the story is over. And now verse 25. Verse 25. Now both of them were naked. Where are we? Do you see that we are in the beginning of a new story? We are naked, a negative. As opposed to what? Not being clothed? Okay? And do you see that you have a whole story and then they clothe themselves? You remember that? And then at a certain moment they say, hey, we are still naked in front of God. Of course you are still naked in front of God. If you have understood nakedness like I have indicated to you, not question of sexuality, but rather that's what I am with all my limitations. I can cover myself, I can hide behind all kinds of masks in front of somebody else. But do you see that in front of God I'm still naked? So there is no irregularity in that text. The text is very, very clear. Hopefully. Okay, so that's all that I do with that text, but I hope at least that you see the different approach. Now, I would like to come now to the conclusion of what we just did with the text. I have given you some of the principles, very brief. I have shown you briefly how that applies to texts. And now, thirdly, what are the advantages and the limits of such text-centered interpretation? You remember that I said last night that author-centered interpretation is historical criticism. This morning I have indicated to you that reader-centered interpretation is, for instance, feminist reading or materialistic reading and things like that. This afternoon, text-centered interpretation is, those of you who are familiar with biblical studies, what is called rhetorical criticism. Rhetorical criticism or literary criticism, or what I explained, some of those principles is what is called semiotics. Those methods, they are really taking the text as a reality in itself. And there was a person in France, he just died a few months ago, who was very, one of the best scholars in semiotics, and he always used to tell us, he says, no salvation outside of the text. No salvation outside of the text. Those of you who study theology, you know what that means, eh? No salvation outside the text. The advantages of those methods that are text-centered, I hope that you all see them. They are taking the text very seriously. They take the text in its final form. They touch upon universally valid rules, they take rules that apply to all text, which makes it possible for readers to understand all texts. The author-centered methods, as I have shown yesterday, are extremely complex. Maybe those are complex too, but they can be learned. Now, the limits or the dangers of that type of text-centered interpretations are that, of course, I suppose that you can guess, this now can become a very fundamentalist approach. If you do not take into account some of the results of other biblical studies, if you do not take into account that this story here of Genesis 2 and 3 is not historical. Do you see the disasters that you could, and I spoke yesterday about the disasters if historical criticism would be eliminated. So I finished my lecture on that third aspect, and I would like to conclude now the three lectures by a kind of a general conclusion of what I tried to do with you during those three lectures. Those of you who are in biblical studies, you know that the interpretation of the scriptures during the first millennium has been long and has a long history. Biblical interpretation is not the invention of the last years. People, as long as they've been reading the scriptures, they have interpreted the scriptures. You know that the writers of the New Testament already interpreted the text of the Old Testament, of the Jewish Bible. Jewish scholars had their own techniques. The fathers of the church followed their own approaches, some allegorical, some literal. But especially since the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th century, gradually very critical methods appeared. And it was in that sense that at the end of the 19th and in the beginning of the 20th centuries, until very recently, the method that was used in biblical studies was the historical critical method. And this was then basically considered as the method. When you spoke about biblical studies, it was historical criticism. It is in the 60s, in the late 60s and the early 70s, that new methods have appeared, new methods. And of course, in the beginning, those methods were under attack. They were under attack. It was not serious. It was not serious. But those people using those new methods, they were extremely critical about the historical, and they spoke about the bankruptcy of historical criticism. They spoke about the end of it. And so those new methods, which were not considered as serious, gradually, through the text, by proving their validity, have entered the biblical world, the academic biblical world. And so what I could foresee, I don't know, we will see, I am not a prophet, but what I think that we will see in the second millennium, and where biblical studies hopefully are going, is that the author-centered interpretation will continue, but will lose of its importance. Because as I indicated yesterday, what I have answered a question that was raised, I think that historical criticism has done a tremendous contribution to the understanding of the Bible, but that we cannot foresee too many new discoveries. But you never know. And I think that people also start questioning many of the results of that type of interpretation, because quite often they are very contradictory and they remain quite often hypotheses. The reader-centered interpretation will always continue, because if we want it or not, every reading is always subjective. And this is important that we know this, because those methods that use the reader-centered interpretation, they have a deep desire to make the Bible come alive and to bring the Bible in contact with the world in front of the text. Those methods are perhaps more existential. This morning someone raised a question about faith. Of course, do you see that is also a question of me as a believer? How can that Bible speak to me? So those methods are more existential. And for believers, consequently, it will be a more religious reading of the text. These readings give more freedom because they trust that the reader can discover meaning. But these reader-centered approaches have also a danger, like I showed this morning, of falling into subjectivism. Not subjective, but subjectivism. So there must be something, like I ended my conference this morning by saying that something has to be there to control our readings. There was a time when biblical commissions and church authorities did that to control our readings. And this applies to all traditions, to all Christian traditions. and also to Jewish traditions. Many scholars of those different traditions, they had difficulties with authorities. But I think that people are less frightened or are less impressed by Bible commissions or by authorities. But still, we need someone or something to control our readings. And this is what text-centered interpretations hope to offer. Such methods believe very strongly that the reader gives the meaning to the text, but that the text itself will be the final judge to accept or to reject certain readings.
Dr. Vogel, kindly accept us to answer questions you would like to bring to our attention. And please try to use the mic in the middle so that everybody can hear you clearly or speak as loud as I'm now doing. Thank you. Well, I would like to use the privilege of the chair a second time. I wonder where the inspiration fit into all that, not to speak of the inerrancy.
I could.
Well, one fool can ask more questions, and why two can ask.
No, but that's. I could say, read what I think inspiration is. Do you see that until now, inspiration was seen too much as what, or was seen basically as a gift of the writer? And inspiration, consequently, was seen a little bit like, when Matthew was writing, somehow, God was telling him all kinds of things. And this theory has been abandoned since quite a while. Why? Because historical criticism has shown, like I have tried to indicate to you, that those texts were not written by one writer, but that those texts have a long history. Okay? And of course, if you say that that text has a long history, that several people were involved in the process of writing that, if you say now that the Spirit inspired an author, my question is, which author? The first one, the second, the third, or the fifth, or the sixth? Okay? And so more and more now, and since also we are conscious that those writers were not people who one day said, I'm going to write a history of Israel, or whatever, but that they collected what the community was believing, so that they were really representative of the community. So we came to an understanding of inspiration, much more, not so much as a personal gift, but as a gift of the community who produced the Bible. Okay? But even then, if you accept some of the things that I have been saying, that when we speak about a text, if we limit inspiration to the author or the producing community, that we forget something very important. If you have accepted that the reader is as important as the writer, because without a reader there is no living book, what would be the Bible if there were no readers? So if we say that inspiration is present in the Bible, I think that inspiration is a quality of the book, a quality of that very unique book. And why has that book a special quality? Because it was produced by a community in which the Spirit was active. And that special book has also the gift of inspiring the community of the readers. So inspiration is not only on one side, but also on the reader side. I don't know if I answered your question.
Your last statement in your conclusion left me with a lot of confusion.
Which one? What was my last statement?
that the text has got subjective interpretations, but the text has the right to reject or accept those interpretations. Now, what do you mean? Is the text, who does the text represent? God? Who does the text represent? Yesterday you told us that some or most of those who wrote the text are dead. So who are we going to ask? How are we going to communicate it to those who wrote the text so that we know our subjective interpretation has been rejected or accepted?
Do you see what your question is, if I understand you correctly? You don't take the text serious. You say, are we going to ask those who wrote it? So you are back into my first lecture. You are back into the writers. Okay? I say, no, the writers are dead. And even, if I read a text and I say to the writer, this is what I understand in the text, I think if a writer is honest, okay, he has perhaps to say, yes, your interpretation is right, even if I have never been thinking of that when I wrote that. Would you accept what I'm saying until now? Okay. So do you see that a text becomes a reality in itself when I, as a writer, or you as a writer, finish your text, and you say to me, here it is now, you lose the authority over your text. If what I read is not what you intended, then my answer would be, why didn't you say it clearer? Okay? Is that okay? So this was my point this afternoon. The text, as soon as the writer puts it into the hands of a reader, the text becomes a reality in itself. And what I try to say this afternoon is, now all those readers are very different. And they bring all kinds of backgrounds to the reading of that same text. And consequently, all those readings are going to be somehow different. But it cannot be that one reads yes and the other reads no in the same text. So who or what is going to judge? The text. To give me an example, that's difficult. Let's say that we have a painting here, okay? A painting of a ship, okay? Do you see that if we are looking at that painting of a ship there, that probably you are not going to ask yourself, who was the painter? But you just look at that painting, okay? And we are all looking at that same painting. Now, do you see that we all look at the same painting, but that nobody sees exactly the same thing? Because if you are, let's say, a sailor, or if you are, do you see, or you just had a holiday with a cruise, do you see all type of other connections are going to relate to that ship? But if someone now says, looking at that same painting, isn't that a beautiful plane? Do you see that the painting says no? You better go and see the eye doctor. Do you see what I am trying to say? Huh? I don't know if you... Of course, it is a very delicate thing, very difficult. But I hope that you, like the sentence that I say, Johnny loves Betty. If you say Betty loves Johnny, I'm sorry. That's not what that text says. That's just an hypothesis that you make, that Betty, maybe if you continue reading, maybe you are going to find that she really loves her Johnny also, but perhaps not. Who said so? Who said so? Yeah. If we accept that the Bible is also a word of humans, you have to accept that the Bible is limited. And of course, we have gone through all that. The Bible is, the Bible says that the world is firmly built And the scientists, they say that the world was turning. You remember the process, Galileo? So there's a bit the same thing for all the rest. I think that we come to better understanding of the text because society is changing, because the readers are changing, the reading community is changing. I don't know, yeah.
It was really clear to me how this structure that you set up applied to the Genesis story, but do you think that, would you also apply it to poetry, or would you apply it to Psalms or the Song of Solomon, or, I mean, do you think, I mean, I'm sort of curious now to take it home and go through everything
Yes.
I've ever read.
Okay, this, thank you for this question. This is, this, what I explained to you is the theory of semiotics, but I explained it in how many minutes, 10 minutes or so? So, of course, this is, don't even try to apply that upon other text. You will have to study it carefully. But to give you an answer, yes, that method applies to any text. But obviously, do you see that there will be much more narrativity that will play when you have a narrative than if you have, a text of the Proverbs, for instance. But in those texts, the discursive is going to play much more. By the discursive, I mean the themes. I had no time even to point to that, but the themes are going to play. And what those scholars say, and I think that's so right, that meaning comes from the opposite. So when you hear poor, you can only speak about poor if there is also rich. And that's what I indicated a few moments ago. You cannot speak about the male when the animals are created. When you are in front of an animal, you identify yourself as human. When you are in front of another human person, you identify yourself as female or as male. Those things. So, whatever text that you can think of, think about the Psalms, think about Paul, how they play upon darkness and light, and, that's all the time the text plays on those things, and that's, and there, if you have understood that the text is a transformation from something into something else, darkness becomes light, do you? And God saw that it was good. Do you hear the evaluation of the story? Yes.
As a Catholic myself, I know that there is this triangular shape. On top you put God the Father, maybe on the left you put God the Son, and on the right God the Holy Spirit.
Okay.
Now, this assumes that this is the organizational structure of the Holy Trinity. On top, God the Father, then here God the Son, then here God the Holy Spirit. Mm-hmm. But then if they are all God, they are supposed to be equal. Therefore, I don't see the logic of God being on top there, and then this other God here, and then this other God here. Now, this bothered me because I was conducting a research, and I realized that the women's movement was trying to reject this, I would call it patriarchal, hierarchical, patriarchal organizational structure, and trying to say, we are trying to come up with, we are calling the transition house movement as transition house service as a service where women are helping each other. We are all equal. There is no structure. We have a flat structure. And some people opposed that and said, no, there has to be structure because God is the one who initiated the structure. He is there, God the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Therefore, you should have somebody above the rest in order to lead the smooth running of the organization. And I'm saying as a feminist, no, that's a patriarchal organizational structure. Could you comment on that? Is it possible to have a flat structure? You mean, we see what I mean? Flat. We are all equal, doing various jobs, but flat, equal, and at the same time, the structure being accepted.
Help. Is there any teacher here in Trinity? Why not make it a circle then, if you wish, or whatever? You wanted to say something? Yeah. Okay, here. I always have a very good excuse. I am in the Hebrew Bible. I never reached the New Testament. And in the Hebrew Bible, there is no such a thing as the Trinity. So, no, when you spoke about the triangle, do you see that all this is pure human reconstructions? So if you put it a triangle, put it flat, or put it in whatever position, that's all human representations of something that we try to explain in whatever way it is. I would not have any objection to put a flat or on a circle or on a triangle. No, I don't see much of a difference there.
Thank you very much, Walter. The Elizabeth Seton lectures have now come to an end, and it is my privilege as chair of the Religious Studies Department to thank all of you, hearers and listeners, and to thank our speaker, Professor Vogels, for his stimulating presentations. In his novel Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll sensibly advised Alice, when telling a tale, quote, to begin at the beginning and go on to the end and then stop. It sounds obvious, but if you listen to conversation attentively, you will notice how often people begin in the middle, realize they left something out, try unsuccessfully to discover the beginning, and probably never get to the end at all, stopping only because they begin on another subject or their audience wanders away. Concerning scriptural interpretations, Christians almost always begin in the middle, that is to say, with their own religious prejudices and denominational dogmas. Then wonder why their interpretation of Scripture seems so confusing and impossible to handle convincingly. In this matter, as in all textual interpretations, we have to begin at the beginning if we are to make sense. Well, Walter, nobody can accuse you of not having started at the beginning. You started right there at the very beginning of creation, with the first and oldest biblical text referring to the creation. And you went on to the end with the fall and promise of recreation, and then you stopped. In the Gospel according to Matthew, Jesus is shown asking his audience after he had taught them, "Have you understood all these things?" They said, "Yes." And Jesus said to them, "Well then, every scribe who becomes a disciple of the kingdom of heaven is like a householder who brings out of his storeroom things both new and old." Walter, you have shown yourself to be such a scribe. You have brought out of your storeroom things both new and old. You have an extraordinary gift of clarity without undue simplification, of balance without undue wishy-washiness, of breadth without undue vagueness. You have been able to blend intellect and compassion, theory and experience, commitment and detachment, knowledge and humor. Your presentation, Walter, is a fine example of all those qualities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Did you hear that he applied already the theory? Detachment, attachment,